Pal Benko passed away last week, leaving a tremendous chess legacy. First, let's consider his achievements as a player. He was a world-class player who twice qualified for the Candidates Tournament in 1959 and 1962. And we're going to look at a game from the Curacao Candidates Tournament of 1962, where he schools a future world champion, one of 3 games that Benko took from Bobby Fischer in his career. Okay, so Benko opens with G3. And one thing I'm going to talk about today is what a great theoretician Pal Benko was. And this is part of his legacy with the white pieces. This opening variation is kind of anti-Peertz, or it could also be played effectively against a King's Indian practitioner like Fischer. And this has become known generally as the Benko system. It was also called the Hungarian variation. Of course, Benko from Hungary. But I remember it as a Benko system, and it's a great legacy to have something that have a very reasonable opening named after you. Now, about the move order, sometimes White flicks in an early H3, maybe with knight C3 instead of castles, to be able to defend the center like this. The move order Benko uses here, Black can play knight c6, and that virtually forces White to take. Bishop e3 runs into knight g4, and d5 White doesn't really want to block the center because with the knight sitting in front of the c pawn, he can't get that pawn attack going. But d takes e5 is not what a lot of Black players are looking for. So Fischer plays c6, but this particular method of playing can very easily lead to a passive position. Okay, so White plays a4, the standard business, preventing b5, knight bd7. Now, when I was a kid, I enjoyed reading the book How to Beat Bobby Fischer by Edmar Mednis. It's basically a collection of Fischer's losses as a professional. And in every game, he had something called the losing moment. You know, I had a big diagram and all caps, the losing moment. And for this game, this was what he called the losing moment, knight bd7. Now, it seems a little bit hyperbolic to say that he's losing already. But after a5, Black is really kind of up against the wall. He's getting a very passive position. White can improve his position easily, and Black is pretty well stuck. So pretty much all future games, you know, Black played a5. All the players in the know stopped that pawn, kept White from gaining more space. The knight can go to d7, and later on, if the knight goes to c5, it's much more stable there. But Fischer ran into a lot of problems, you know, and he was, you know, he's still a teenager at the time, and you know, did not have the full sophistication of his later years. And Benko takes some advantage of it. All these are very natural moves, improving, squeezing. And now when Fischer tries to break out, things just really get worse. b4 and b5, and that forces a crack in Black's central pawn formation, which is pretty deadly when you're this tight for space. So Fischer is forced to create a weakness on d5, but also it's very hard to defend the d pawn. In fact, it's really impossible to defend the d pawn. And after e5, it's basically gone. King f2, so okay, moves the king to the center to get ready for any kind of invasion. Queen f3, not allowing that counterplay. And now after rook d8, now Benko makes a few mistakes after here. He could play knight e4, probably the strongest move. And after d takes e5, f5 is the killer, because takes allows queen g5 check, and the rook is hanging. And if you can't take it, the rook doesn't have a good move. Rook goes back, f6 could be particularly killing, threatening queen h6, and also knight d6 is still in the position. Maybe even knight d6 right away is the simplest. So Black could not play d takes e5, and so things get worse. But Benko just played it safe. It's possible he was getting short of time, I haven't read the story of this game, but it later on it kind of seems to indicate the move seemed to indicate that he was low on time. So knight c6. Sorry, he trades the knights. Unfortunately for Fischer, rook takes d6 is squashed by queen e5 with a pin, and the only way black can well, he can try to save actually he can try to save the rook with that, but here queen check on the 8th and take the queen that wins the rook, and the other move rook d8 is bashed by rook d7, game over, mate or winning the queen. So he has to live with that d pawn. But still, in this position, it's tricky for white to effect a breakthrough. I guess the idea is probably to put the pawn on g5 to starve the queen and maybe bring the king in, and maybe, well, probably king can't really go all the way to e5, but at some point I think that white will be able to bring the rook to the a file and penetrate there. So Fischer makes a break for it. Especially, I think he figures he might as well do it before the time control is over. So check, and now king g3, queen g5, queen e4 would pretty much squelch all the counterplay, and the pawns start coming forward. But Fischer got a little bit of a break here after king g2, queen h4. Now he has to play rook f1, and black at least gets a whiff of counterplay. Queen h3, and now the game ends. That seems very precipitous, doesn't it? Well, the explanation is the fact that in these old-time games, they had adjournments. So undoubtedly, after move 40 reached, Benko sealed his next move. And in fact, either king f2 or king e1 wins, or even king g1 would just repeat. So it's not really critical what his sealed move is. So Fischer would have resigned this game before resumption. And sometimes players did that. I think he would have, if it's one session like today, he would just continue playing for a few moves. But he figured that the position was lost. White is going to be able to escape the checks. There's a few ways of doing it. And once he does that, the pawns in the center will decide. So a little bit sloppy at the end, but Benko, you know, with a big win over Fischer, and that, you know, that opening system, remember, this is 1962. It's endures to the day. People still play it. So that's part of his legacy there as a theoretician, but of course not the biggest one. Okay, just to touch on a few things as a player, he played on 6 U.S. Olympiad teams. I think he played as high as board 2 and won a board prize. He didn't have much success in the U.S. Championship, which I was surprised to see, but I found the same thing with Robert Byrne, who won 1 title. But by the time Benko got to America, he was blocked by Bobby Fischer. However, in open tournaments, he had a great record. He won 8 U.S. Open titles, and that is the most in history. And he was known as King of the Swiss. So he must have been very successful in those American tournaments, winning a whole bunch of them. Now, to get back to his theoretical prowess, first let me mention, apropos to Fischer, one of the things Benko is most famous for is stepping aside to allow Fischer to play in the 1970 interzonal, and Fischer parlayed that to sweep through the candidates matches and beat Boris Spassky for the title in 1972. So, you know, Benko certainly could put his ego aside. He realized that what a great player Fischer was, and he certainly did a proper for the whole chess community of America. Fischer getting that opportunity, very selfless act on Benko's part. All right, on to the Banco Gambit. In my opinion, that opening is one of the most profound, brilliant opening creations of all time. It's a gambit that is entirely strategical and long-term in nature. Most gambits are about developing your pieces quickly and either playing for checkmate or taking advantage of opponents being unable to develop. In the Banco Gambit, White could develop his pieces, but there's that pressure that lasts for a long time. So we're going to go back to the beginning, the debut of the Banco Gambit in international competition up next. All right, now Banco had played the Banco Gambit a few times in American tournaments, but remember there was very little information spread back then. There was no internet. Most of the games played in tournaments, you didn't find out about them, or maybe much later, if somebody wrote a book or wanted to publish something in a magazine article. So it's possible that Vukic had no knowledge of this opening at all, and this is it, the Banco Gambit. Now, of course, White doesn't have to take. There's E3, a move that was kind of developed later. Sometimes White plays a sharp way of giving the pawn back, knight C3 and E4, and a popular system these days is B6, giving the pawn back, and that just shows, how minds have evolved. That open line may be more valuable to Black than the pawn itself. But Vukic, of course, took the pawn. Benko took back. Now, later on, this line evolved a little bit. G6, Benko started playing it this way, and only after knight C3, bishop takes A6. And the idea is that there is a possible system with B3, solving the problem of developing the bishop and opposing the bishop on G7. But it's a kind of a strong idea for Black to take, with ideas of D6, bishop F5, and knight B4. And this kind of refutes the B3 idea. So that's why people play that move order. But bishop A6, okay, Vukic played very standard moves here. G6. And okay, so the first thing is this pressure here. So, White could play E4, but Black takes, and then White is not going to castle. He's going to have to waste some time, and also going to create a weakness on this D3 square that Black might occupy later. So White plays G3. Let me just say a little bit in general about this. What does Black have? He has these two half-open files. He has that long diagonal, bishop on G7. Long diagonal cannot be blocked by pawns. So that bishop is bearing down on B2. It's giving White a hard time developing, and Black will have this eternal pressure there, and it's very hard for White to deal with. Now, the modern move order for Black is to go knight BD7 here, and the idea is to put the knight on B6 to freeze the queen, prevent queen C2. This was, I think, largely developed by Lev Albert, who was kind of the heir to the Banco legacy. And he, three-time U.S. champion, of course, played many great Banco Gambits, taking the opening up from Benko. But remember, this is the early days. This is 1967. So there's a lot more learned about this opening. But still, it seems fairly modern, even for the time. Queen C2, I mean, White plays a good plan. Now, generally, if you're able to play B3 and bishop B2, White tries to do that. Sometimes that runs into C4. It's tempting to attack this pawn, and Black can even defend it with the king, but here Benko decided to retreat the queen. And he puts pressure on that D pawn, so White trades the bishops. But after that trade, he becomes a little bit weak on light squares. Rook E1, the computer really doesn't like this move, and perhaps Vukic did not anticipate this E6 move, which is kind of thematic. Once the bishops disappear, and that creates some weaknesses on the light squares and the long diagonal. We don't get to see it in this game, and I don't have a game to show you with it happening, but an important strategic idea here would be failed tactically, usually something you don't do with the queens on the board, but Benko and others won many games with f5 to undermine the pawn and then take d5. But here he goes e6. And just with simple moves, black gets full compensation for the pawn. The d pawn is strong. The a2 pawn is still a target. This diagonal is in play. The knight at b6 might be jumping into c3. And after Vukic plays his error a4, basically overlooking queen b7, now the pawn on a4 drops. And in this opening, when one of those pawns drops, usually the other one does too. And Vukic decides to give that pawn up, kind of desperate, but not quite as crazy as it appears in the game, because rook b2 is maybe not so accurate, because white can actually play rook takes f7, and he's going to be able to jump into the 7th rank with the other rook. And maybe white even has enough counterplay to make a draw. The rooks on the 7th are very strong with the knight attacking. But yeah, so possibly g5 instead of rook b2, g5 was stronger. Stuff hard to see, of course, without an engine, you know, and they didn't have engines in those days. So a lot of these things they never knew about the game, because it didn't come to light. But after rook e2, now everything's simple, because it's now just purely into an end game, and black's pass pawn will be decisive. And he kicks that knight, and okay, so to save it, white gives an exchange, but it's only temporary. He's going to lose the knight anyway. King f2 would be answered by c2, and it's amazing how often black queens a pawn in the Benko Gambit with that minority, that c pawn, because that c pawn is like a candidate to queen, because you get pressure on that b pawn. If you don't take it directly, you take a2 and then b3, and the c pawn queen so often for black in this opening. Here it took a little detour, went to d4 and then back to the c file, but it is very thematic. It's also interesting that, you know, the player that really succeeded Benko's generation at the top of American chess was Walter Brown, and he took up this opening. And Benko was kind of at some point was kind of surprised to see that Walter had started to call it the Brown Benko Gambit after Benko showed him the finer points of it. It's kind of funny, but. Yeah, the Banco Gambit. I mean, it's you know, that's just really legendary to be the guy that I don't know if he exactly invented the Gambit. I suppose there's probably earlier examples of it than Banco, but he was the guy that developed it, all the ideas, and played it consistently. Now, his path through life was not easy. He was born in 1928. His family was harshly treated by the Soviets during World War II. And so it's understandably, he was determined to get out of communist Hungary. That was, you know, as a young player, that was goal number one for him all the time. And he first tried to defect in Berlin in 1952, but was not successful, and he was detained in a concentration camp basically for a year, barely surviving. Was so happy to finally taste freedom again in 1953, and he played and worked towards escaping. And finally, 4 years later, he had a chance to tournament in Iceland, and walked into the U.S. embassy and defected. And it was great for him, great for the United States. He came to the country, didn't have any money, but after all his hardships, Benko was he was happy just to be free. Now those hard times made him tough, but they did not affect his demeanor. He was, from many accounts, friendly and gracious to fans and fellow players alike. He was a virtuoso composer of both mating problems and endgame studies. I recall many instances where he showed some of his positions to me with great enthusiasm and great enjoyment on my part as well. He had two long-running columns in Chess Life, The Practical Endgame, which taught me quite a lot, and Benko's Bafflers. It's a little personal story. In the late 1970s, a chess variant called pre-chess was briefly promoted, with Benko and Arthur Bisguyer asked to play a match to test it out. Now, it was kind of a forerunner of Chess 960. Pre-chess had the players, you had all the pawns set up, and you had the players place the pieces on the back row one by one, in one turn at a time. Benko was kind to play some games against the teenage Joel Benjamin at the Manhattan Chess Club. I was able to score okay with black. Now, remember, Benko was about 50 at the time. He was, past his prime. But I did well with black because I would wait for him to put his king down, and then I'd put my king down on the other side, and I'd start playing for mate. And in a tactical game, I was able to take advantage of the old guy every now and then. But when I had white, I'd put my king down. He'd put his king down on the same side, and then it would be a positional game, and he would just destroy me. he still had enough to do it. I was guess about IM level. Well, actually, this was even before that. So, but I was maybe 2400, and he was able to take me down. But I really enjoyed playing the games. Okay, I mean, this only so much I can say about him in the time afforded by this show, but he was really as legendary as any legend we've had. He died at 91. He had a long life. He had a great international career, both playing for Hungary and the United States. He won a lot of tournaments. He developed the Banco Gambit, which my friend John Fedorovich would sometimes purposely call the Volga Gambit in his presence, just to tease him. But he was, as I said, great composer, great endgame player. Passed his knowledge along. He wrote a fair bit, many columns, and he was just a really very good person, and very well liked in the community. And he was a hands-on guy. He was connected to the people, yeah, I mean, he's a guy that we're all going to really miss. But as with everyone in their passing, it reminds us to reflect on what they achieved as in their careers, and Benko did on so many levels. So the chess legend Pal Benko, dead at age 91, gone, but not forgotten. Well,